progress.
Welcome everyone to this special council meeting of the Tacoma Park City Council. I'd like to call us to order this evening. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar.
Here.
Councilmember Dvala.
Present.
Councilmember Kostick.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Searcy.
Here.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. We're very excited to have our Reimagining Public Safety Task Force with us tonight to present their final report. In a moment, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Councilwoman Searcy, to kind of remind us of how we got here this evening. But before we do that, I just want to extend my thanks to everyone who helped, all the folks at Link who will introduce themselves in a moment, all the task force members who will be introduced tonight. There is a ton of work, as you will hear, that has gone into the report. And I just want to thank everyone for all their commitment and their hard work throughout this process. In addition, I want to say, and I'll say this again in a little bit in our meeting, is that this is not an end. We're not at the beginning, but we're also not at the end. We have a lot of work still ahead of us in the city, but we want to celebrate tonight the work that's been done, digging deep on hearing these recommendations, and looking forward to how we can move forward in our community on reimagining public safety. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Councilwoman Searcy.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor Stewart. And I also want to send my sincere appreciation out to not only our consultants with Link, but also to each and every person who participated in the Public Safety Task Force. I've been along for the ride, and I know how much work and time that you all have put into diving deep into some really complex issues that not only as it pertains to our city, but also understanding what's happening at the state and county level. So I want to again echo the mayor in saying thank you, thank you, thank you for your commitment to our city and your commitment to social justice. So I just want to thank you all for that. And so I think we can get started. And I just want to remind my colleagues of kind of why we're here, right? So we passed a resolution establishing the Public Safety Task Force for the purpose of doing a deeper dive into how we as a city are addressing public safety concerns, not just as it relates to policing, but all facets of public safety, and how we can ensure that there's efforts underway and that we are operating in a way that is designed to address racial inequities that might exist in terms of the provision of services within our city, but also in terms of police response. So we put together the task force. We had so many people to sign up. I was so excited for the number of folks. So many new voices stepped up to the plate and volunteered to participate in this group. And what we've asked them to do is to develop recommendations that we as a council can review and develop an implementation approach to address some of the challenges that they are highlighting tonight. So again, I don't want to belabor the point because this is really the task force meeting. And an opportunity for them to talk through their recommendations, and for others who have not been a part of the mini meetings to learn more about the various data that has been leveraged and collected over the course of this exercise. So with that, I will turn things over to our Link partners.
Awesome.
And the task force.
Thank you, Councilwoman, and thank you, Madam Mayor, for that wonderful intro and orienting the public here to the task force. So before we jump in, I'd like to do a quick round robin of introductions to the task force members. So I'll kind of do a popcorn style and kind of just choose on the folks that I see in order of my screen. So I'll kick it off with Ajmal.
Good evening, everyone. Ajmal Qureshi, Ward 3.
Awesome. And yeah, if folks can state their name and affiliation, that would be great. Michael.
Michael Rubin, Ward 2.
Thank you, Michael. Adam.
Hi, everyone. Adam Braskish, Ward 6. I work for the Justice Department. I'm a former police officer.
Thank you, Adam. Christina.
Hi, everyone. Christina Morado, Ward 4, assistant principal in a middle school.
Thank you, Christina. Cedric.
Cedric Boatman, should be Ward 4.
Thank you. Kiminori.
Kiminori Nakamura, Ward 6 with the University of Maryland.
Thank you, Kiminori. Jide.
Jide Atoyebi, Ward 6.
Thank you, Jide. And then Jumana.
Jumana Musa, I'm a 20-year resident of Ward 6 and the director of the Fourth Amendment Center at the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers.
Thank you, Jumana. I think, and then Emil. Emil, can you hear us? I'll come back to you, Emil, to introduce yourself when it's time. So next slide, and we'll jump into a bit of overview of the task force and how we got to this point. And you'll also get to hear from my colleagues and my team and co-facilitators once we go throughout the slide deck. So just to orient you all on the research and resources. So we did a lot to orient and inform the future of the task force. The task force saw lots of data in new visual formats and disaggregated formats. So we started and reviewed over 600 pages of foundational materials that included reports from other cities, counties, and states, and even some national bodies that focused on public safety. And this research and materials the task force members took a deep dive on was before the actual task force meeting started. So 600 pages of materials really to help orient it and set the focus of the task force. So we knew throughout the process that that the task force was going to want to invite in some SMEs, subject matter experts, to kind of help inform the task force thoughts and recommendations. So we asked the task force what SMEs they wanted to hear from, and they sent their recommendations. So all 25 SMEs were experts that were requested to kind of help orient the process and some of the recommendations. We also left lots of room in the process for the task force and any additional questions or requests for any additional data to inform the final recommendations. And then lastly, we took a deep dive into the Tacoma Park traffic stops, arrest, and budgetary and city and other city agencies' data assets and issues. Next slide, please. So if you're asking where's all this data, where's all of these documents and resources, they all live public. So one of the benefits of this process is not just that the recommendations are public and live online, but we wanted to ensure that all of the data and resources the task force used to inform some of these recommendations live publicly. So all of this data you see right here on the screen and resources you currently lives on the website for public view. And if you're reading the report, in addition, the report and the appendix, all of these are linked in the appendix as resources, data, and documents that the task force utilized to, again, inform some of the recommendations. So you see the website right there at the bottom right, and you can also get to it by going to the tacomaparkmaryland.gov and go to initiatives and go to the project directory and Reimagining Public Safety part of that website. So I'll toss it over to my colleague, Cordell.
Hello, everyone. As Jamal indicated, there was a tremendous amount of data that the task force members were going through. And so we decided the best route forward would to be to break this incredible group of public servants into smaller groups to go after specific issues. And so we had 3 subcommittees, the first one being the Community Quality of Life Committee, and Jevin Hodge, a colleague, was the moderator. We had Sawa, Duane, Ajamel, Emil, and Christina as a part of that committee. And they looked at the quality of life
Cordell, you're on mute.
Apologies. They looked at the quality of life and the intersection of public safety with the quality of life. So issues such as housing and mental health and all of what it meant for budget, policies, and other programs. The next group was the one I had the privilege of moderating, and that is the alternative methods and responses. Community members included Michael, Jide, Sadie, Cedric, and Zatali. What I loved about my committee was the multi-generational approach. Because of who was on the committee, we got a very interesting mix of views and opinions, but we looked at current police policy practices for emergency and non-emergency calls, especially as it related to mental health issues. As we know, a lot of calls are generated because of mental health issues, but we also had an opportunity to compare and contrast, look at not only what's going on in Montgomery County, the region, but also the country as it related to different reform efforts. And so it made for very, very robust conversations at pretty much every single meeting. The last subcommittee, this is our community engagement and transparency group. It was moderated by Jamal Holtz, and the committee members included Lauren, Adam, Jumana, and Kiminori. So a very august group of leaders. And this group looked at, they evaluated different policies related to data sharing, what should be shared with the public versus what stays at the department. Also, the committee looked at existing efforts to consider new approaches to recruiting and retaining public safety professionals. Now, while a fair amount of conversation happened at the subcommittee level, all of their recommendations went up to the entire group. And so the recommendations that you'll hear are the result of the entire task force, not just the subcommittees. So I will move the mic over to my colleague, Jevin, to talk about the ways that we engaged.
Thank you, Cordell. Madam Mayor, members of the council, task force members, thank you all for having us today. We deeply appreciate you all. As Cordell mentioned, we organize into subcommittees to process the great amount of information that we received over the course of this process. The key to the public engagement and the process overall was the sheer amount of time we spent together as a body. And the fact that all of these meetings were held, all of the task force meetings were held open to the public. The task force met from March 16th through July 8th for a total of 18 meetings, spanning over 40 hours of direct task force engagement. Every Tuesday since March, we've had a task force meeting or a subcommittee meeting. We've spent a lot of time together. We've gotten to know each other very well over the last few months. Next slide, please. If you are a visual learner, here's a visual calendar to show you. You'll notice that we've added a month of meetings at the request of the task force, and it was approved by the council. There's definitely more work to be done. You'll see a recommendation about this later, but the time we allocated, we were spent maximizing every second that we had together. Next slide, please. One thing that's very important to note that all of the meetings, all of the agendas, all of the slide decks, they all live online. You can see it here. If you look at this slide, you'll see that every agenda, every meetings, every video link is linked to this site. So regardless of what form you want to digest the information, you can gather that. And if you'll note the note at the bottom here, all of our meetings that we've had have received over 600 views from our online visitors, which is just absolutely remarkable. Next slide, please. You'll note that one thing that is very critical to the process is how much stakeholder engagement was done across the board. Community listening sessions, public comment forums, focus groups, stakeholder interviews, business walks, tour of the dispatch center. We met the communities where they were, and we did everything possible to incorporate stakeholders in the process. We held focus groups, so the ambassador focus group was of individuals that were not selected to be a part of the task force, but we kept them involved in the process so that they can provide their insight, and we can utilize that for the process at hand. We had focus groups with police officers. We did so that we can get folks at different times throughout the day, so that we can get folks working the day shift or the night shift, so that their voices were involved in the process. We had the public comment form where we received over 40 comments from various different mediums. The task force report contains extensive details and all of the numbers to back everything up here and support that. Next slide, please. And lastly, for the engagement session, you'll see that everything I talked about, that my colleague Jamal referenced, lives right here online. The vast majority of the reports of the items that we listed earlier lives right here, so you can take a look at your convenience. And just a reminder for the viewers out there, please go to the Tacoma Park website so that you can take a look at this. You can view all the resources, and additionally, all of the items that are listed here is included in your report. It is my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Michael.
Excellent. And I will spend 2 minutes, and then the rest of this meeting is all task force as it should be. Very proud of the work that has been done here. We get the real pleasure of leading community engagement around the country around really complex and complicated issues. I have such reverence for the work that this task force did. As you saw in the bios and in the introductions, this is a pretty remarkable collection of human beings that share a lot of different views on these topics, and they came together and worked hard. And I think the report shows all of that. So the subcommittee, as we talked about, developed a lot of recommendations at a subcommittee level. Those all rolled up to a full task force list of draft recommendations. That very raw and kind of unedited list was shared at a community listening session on June 28th. And since that time, the task force has been working together as a full task force to figure out what recommendations would be moving forward, which ones were full task force recommendations, and which ones needed additional discussion. I think it's really important for the council to understand where these recommendations come from, and the task force will speak to the goals, etc. Some of these come from very specific things that the task force saw that could be done better in Tacoma Park, and very specific recommendations about how to do them better. Others come from a belief that we're Tacoma Park, and Tacoma Park can't just be good, Tacoma Park has to be great, and that there is a best in class on these issues, and we need to strive for that. So some of these do take national models and say we need to strive for that. And then others recognize that there are some things that the Tacoma Park Council doesn't have authority over, but the task force is asking for some advocacy behind. How can we shine some light on some of the best practices that we need to move forward? Next slide, please. The task force really organized its work into trying to answer 3 questions. What are we trying to solve for? What solutions can we offer? And then how will implementation and evaluation be measured, which you'll hear more of from the task force. After these recommendations started coming together, we realized they fell into 5 main topic areas. It wasn't as if we picked these topic areas and then found recommendations for each. Recommendations came together, and then they formed these 5 topic areas: community-led engagement, new departments functions, communication, policing enforcement, and education and training. Tonight, as soon as I'm done here, you'll hear from 5 task force members who will give you a high-level overview of each of these topics. And then after that, the task force is happy to answer any questions you have with as much detail as you'd like. Last slide here. It's important, and I want to say this on behalf of the task force. The task force put forward the recommendations that are informed by the access to information they had at this moment in time. It was a time-bound process, and they did phenomenal work. So look at recommendations that way. Some of these are very baked recommendations. Some of them are not fully baked recommendations yet, and we understand that. We need the council and expect the council, and the task force wants the council to be a full partner in making sure that as these move forward, it's being done in a spirit of partnership, because there's only so much you can do, even in a really robust 3-month process. We really see this as advancing the ball significantly down the field, and now the next step of picking this up and doing it together. Last couple of things here. As I mentioned, an amazing collection of humans with a lot of amassed experience. There are some task force members who would have liked recommendations to go either further, and I'm sure there are some task force members for whom the recommendations went further than they were initially thinking they would. That's natural and good. You want a process where you're not watering down recommendations to try and find some middle that doesn't exist. This was a task force that did the really hard work of consensus, and the vast majority of the recommendations in here are consensus recommendations on behalf of the whole task force. There are some where that just wasn't possible, and we didn't want to water them down to get to that point. So in those cases where the task force wasn't unified, there's a majority and a minority opinion in the task force, and that was quantified with a vote of the task force on those items that really should give you kind of the terms of debate. Some of us thought this in a majority sense, some of us in a minority sense thought this, and that should inform the debate going forward. And so 50 recommendations going forward, really proudly from the task force, and we're all looking forward to the next steps. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our task force. Again, we got 5 task force members. Each are going to present on one topic area. And I believe the first person up is Sadie. Sadie, take it away.
Hi, all. I will be presenting on the community-led engagement and oversight portion of our recommendations. And specifically, this one main recommendation that actually all of our subcommittees developed the idea of separately, and then we all kind of joined together to simmer down exactly what we wanted, and then we created this joint recommendation, which is to develop some kind of additional task force that would work to, one, keep the city accountable in implementing these recommendations to the best of their ability, and also analyze further some ideas that our task force felt we didn't have sufficient time or information to flesh out, like the idea of the city transitioning to the Maryland State Pension Plan. As you can see in, which number is it? I think letter G on the slide. And so some of these things that we have included in this new task force would be that members should be offered a stipend in their participation in this task force. We feel like that would encourage many members of the community that might not be able to just immediately volunteer their time due to childcare needs, financial reasons, etc. And they should represent different wards and groups such as individuals with disabilities, individuals that speak different languages, of different races, ethnic backgrounds, and different sexual orientations, among many other things. And this group should engage with the community, particularly in regards to accessible communication, and not just engage with Tacoma Park residents, but also business owners, etc. And in order to have the task force have the recommendations seriously listened to and considered, we are recommending that a written response to all recommendations is provided afterwards in regards to why certain recommendations were not being considered, and that written response should be made accessible to the public as well. We suggest that this task force produce some kind of annual report, collecting data, other things, and one specific reason that definitely my subcommittee recommended having an additional task force was for the future analyzation of data that can be collected and looked at in regards to like how the implementation of our current recommendations are taking effect. There are some pilot programs that will be recommending, and just other policies that we'd like to see. And it would be great if there could be a task force in the future that would be able to look, analyze, and see how these changes are taking effect and whether they would like to recommend those in the future or change some things. And I guess just like an overarching theme is transparency. All data and information given to this task force should be made public. And I know something that members of the community have said in our open sessions is that they would have loved for our subcommittee groups to be recorded and made accessible to the public. So we could also start anew with what are we labeling as transparent for this future task force, and include even more transparent steps, and also just releasing more of the data that our task force was given in the process. I'm not sure if I covered everything, but I'm happy to answer questions about that.
Thank you, Sadie. Ajmal.
Good evening, everyone. Ajmal Qureshi again. Just want to begin by thanking Link as well as all of my fellow task force members for all of their hard work. I think that, it's been a tremendously difficult year, tremendously difficult 2 years, to be honest, for a lot of us. And I think to be able to find time to do this work in the midst of all of the extra parenting, all of the extra Zoom calls, was a tremendous sacrifice for a lot of team members, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you for the work that you put in. Thank you. The overarching goal behind the new departments and function section of the recommendations was to take a hard look at what the Tacoma Park Police Department does right now, and not really ask, are they doing a bad job, but is this the best possible model of what the role of the police department should be? And so we asked hard questions both to the police department. We also heard a lot from community members as to their interactions with the police department, and also spoke to national and local experts about different models of what the responsibilities of the police department should be, as well as what the size of the police department should be. And I think one of the overarching themes that came through is, unsurprisingly, in Tacoma Park, as well as around the country, too often, and this isn't the fault of any individual officer or the leadership of the police department, but as a function of our larger criminal justice system, too often we criminalize things that shouldn't be criminalized, and that has a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown members of our community. And so these two next recommendations are specifically aimed at addressing the fact that we in the United States over-criminalize things that shouldn't be and don't need to be criminalized. The first recommendation is to create a community assistance office and community safety team. This was directly in response to multiple comments and wisdom that we received from community members that too often police officials are called on to respond to mental health emergencies, and we don't have sufficient resources in place to provide assistance to individuals who need mental health services, and we don't have sufficient supports available to respond to mental health crises when they occur. So the purpose of number two, and I won't read through it in detail, was to devote additional resources to mental health services such that the police department is not the primary responder for mental health crises and emergencies, which can lead to unnecessary criminalization, but also dangerous interactions with the police, dangerous for the individuals who are having mental health services. So that's the focus there. Again, I'm not going to read through the entire thing because I know you all can read through it yourself, but I want to make one overarching point. The amount of detail we put in these recommendations is intentional. We know that as task force members, we don't have the power to vote on these things or put them into action. We've done everything we can up to this point. And the detail in there isn't there to sort of say, here are some ideas we have. This is detail that we've dug into and we've thought deeply about. And we want you to take the detail seriously. And if you act on the recommendations, which we hope you do, that you see the recommendation as a whole and take seriously the idea of incorporating much of the detail that's in there. That's intentional, and they should be seen as one and part of the whole. 2.1 has a similar intention, thank you, as the one I've just discussed, but is a little bit different. Again, we recognize that there's an over-criminalization happening of Black and Brown members of our community, and that's happening from the fact that we're criminalizing things that don't necessarily need to be criminalized. And the idea was perhaps we can, as many people in the civil rights community talk about, reduce the touch of the criminal justice system on Black and Brown members of the community, which means reducing the presence of individuals who may and can and have the authority to arrest individuals and get them involved in the criminal justice system. Along those lines, we recommended the establishing of a neighborhood services division in Tacoma Park that will be responsible for dealing with issues like parking violations, speed camera monitoring, red light camera operations, crossing guards, and code enforcement, things which in our country we too often criminalize, which leads to unnecessary involvement with the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. Thank you. Along those same lines, I think what we recognize and what we heard from in Tacoma Park is that right now in Tacoma Park, unlike what is being done in other progressive jurisdictions around the country, response for there is not a non-police response line that individuals can reach out to where they can seek help where it doesn't immediately first go to the police department. So one of the strong recommendations from the committee was to establish a 24-hour line where residents can request a non-armed police response. And the gist of it was that when you're calling for help, it's not going to the police first, it's going to someone who isn't going to have that automatic reaction that this requires police intervention. And along those same lines, recommendation number 4 calls for training dispatchers and establishing protocols related to mental health emergencies. This goes hand in hand with number 3, ensuring that individuals who are answering the dispatch line are not only not police officials, but they're actually trained to refer individuals to mental health services and refer to the appropriate agencies that we've discussed, such as the community service team that can respond to mental health emergencies. I think I have a few more comments, but I will reserve those until my second piece later on. Thank you so much. Oop, I guess I have a few more things to talk about. Sorry about that. You get more of my voice. I apologize. So I think that this goes, we've talked a little bit about the role of the police department. I won't belabor too much on these last 3, although they are really important. I think when we spoke about public safety in the context of the task force, we recognize that public safety not only means what an individual's actions with the criminal justice system and the police department meant, but public safety in all aspects of their lives, in terms of on a day-to-day basis, were they living and functioning in an environment in which they were safe? Not only in terms of, again, the police department, but literally is the actual environment in which they function safe. And what we heard from a variety of different individuals was that they needed additional social services resources, specifically with regards to finding safe, adequate, and livable housing. And that's the idea behind devoting additional staff to the Tacoma Park Housing and Community Development Department. Oftentimes we thought individuals didn't know about resources that were available. And so we thought Tacoma Park could do a better job of marshaling together those resources and making sure that different departments were working together, but also the public had a greater understanding of what resources were actually there, thus the city resource coordinator. And then finally, my colleague Jumana Musa spoke very passionately and very eloquently throughout the course of the task force about the need for a victim witness coordinator. Right now, the responsibilities for a victim's advocate and a witness coordinator are housed within the same individual. And as Ms. Musa spoke about, based on her personal experience in her professional life, oftentimes the roles of those 2 individuals don't mesh up. Thus, there's a need for those 2 roles to be separated. And I think now I have finished my current responsibilities. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, Christina, you are up.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. The following 7 recommendations under this heading of communications are really designed to engage the Tacoma Park community and increase transparency. And again, that's not to suggest that there's a belief that there's a desire to be cagey or obtuse. Rather, I think these recommendations lend themselves to access and how people are able to get information and how information is provided. So number 8 is around creating a role potentially for a public information officer for city communications, so that there's someone who is responsible for how information goes out across all the city departments. Number 9 is specific to the city and police department websites, and not to go into each of the specific things, but to consider for individuals in the community with visual or hearing impairments, web reader, to create specific emails for departments so that people know that they can just type police something .gov or recreation or whatever, so that it's a little bit more streamlined and uniform. And the largest recommendation here is around how information is shared. So creating FAQs that talk about the mediation, that talk about the training that police officers receive, that provide data in a chunked format. Like if you wanted to see what types of stops were happening, that information could be provided, or what type of different calls that dispatch was managing. That information would be accessible through FAQs for the community to get a quick glance. And we make, so that's the first part. Number 10, strengthening communication and increasing access for members who are potentially with more marginal technology access. And so what would that look like, so that there's a way to publicize what is happening and communicate what the city is doing beyond just what is available on the internet. Next slide, please. Number 11 falls under the goal of increasing transparency and advanced notice regarding the budgeting process. And one of our recommendations was that information about the Tacoma Park budget is publicized, and the meeting where it will be voted on by the council is publicized a month in advance to increase knowledge and allow for people to disseminate and participate in that conversation. And number 12, again, as I think you've already noticed from two of the people that have spoken before me, housing found its way into a lot of different things. And one of the areas that we felt like would make sense to amplify in our community is housing buildings, the code violations in different housing buildings across Tacoma Park over the last 12 months. So that people could see and have real information on sort of the status of the buildings where they are living. Thank you. Wait, I think I have two more, sorry. And then specifically around communications related to public safety data. Number 13 is to make all of the information that we had access to for this work, the 600 pieces of material and resources that was referenced at the very beginning of this presentation, should be accessible by the community. I think that it's a lot of information and there's a lot of going back, but I also think that people have real interest in this, as is evidenced by many things that have already been mentioned. And then the final recommendation here around public safety and communication is to be specific and provide clear, not guidelines or in any way suggest restrictions, but to provide more information about when is the best, what is a best 911 call and what the other options are if there's like a real need that actually wouldn't be solved by police, and to sort of like a public I can't think of the word, but that's like a public information service to sort of clarify what makes sense for 911 and what the other options are. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris, for your comments. Now, Adam, you're up.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is a large section, so I'll try to move at a good clip here. The first set of recommendations around policing and enforcement is to support officer well-being and recruitment. The idea here is that if you have better officers, you're going to have better policing. And that starts with making sure that officers have the mental health services that they need. So some of this may be provided by the city already, but we want to make sure that officers are afforded confidential mental health services if they need stress management or anything like that, given the challenges of the job, if they can get that without fear of retaliation. Another recommendation is that the council explore rental subsidies for officers who may want to live in Tacoma Park, but may be unable to do so given their salaries and the cost of living here. So if there are officers who are interested in that, and a slight subsidy might allow them to incorporate better into the community, we hope the council will consider that. Moving on to number 18. The goal of these next recommendations is to move away from low-level enforcement and to get officers more focused on serious crime. And this really reflects kind of an echoing of what Chief Duvall has already tried to accomplish since 2018 and has accomplished. I think we recognize that he has ushered in a change where the sheer number of stops, for example, is not prioritized so much as making sure that they're quality stops. So we want that to continue and to keep moving in that direction. So we recognize that an exhaustive list of police officers should spend their time on this and not on that is probably outside the scope of this task force, and we hope that the permanent task force will be able to drill down on that and work with the community and gather their input and work with the police department to make specific recommendations about how we want police officers spending their time and to make sure that that gets translated into clear guidance to the officers who are on the line. Number 20 also on this slide is a reform around consent searches, and this is sort of a hot topic in criminal justice reform, and the District of Columbia has implemented a policy whereby officers have to orally deliver a certain advice of rights and make sure that they secure a waiver. So this is very similar to that, except that it's requiring that the waiver and the advice of rights be in writing and that it be in a language that the subject of the search is comfortable with. And additionally, we're just asking the police department continue to make sure that they record, additional information about stops, race, and whether searches were conducted, so that the police department and perhaps the permanent task force as well can identify any problematic trends. The next topic is speed cameras. The goal here was to balance the need for traffic safety with the negative impact that a civil fine can have on people of limited means. Our primary solution here is to implement a poverty exemption that has been put in place in a lot of other jurisdictions. I believe there are some footnote citations that the council members can check out. But the idea is that if an individual or individual's income or their household income is below a certain threshold, they can apply for an exemption and be granted an exemption so that they don't have to pay the fine from the speed camera. And when it comes to creating additional speed cameras, our hope is that the council will make sure that there's adequate public notice and opportunity for community input before they're established, and that this is really only done in areas where it's absolutely needed for traffic safety. There are some jurisdictions where speed cameras are just put where people happen to speed briefly and it's used as a revenue generating scheme. We have no reason to think that the city is doing that currently. We hope that that will continue and that will not be what speed cameras are used for. The next goal is really about just incentivizing good policing. We did a number of business walks, and business owners and some community members communicated that they wanted a greater police presence. So the question is, how to deliver that. And we want to make sure that there is clearer and greater communication between business owners and residents, which is something that will be, that is part of our proposal for the public safety auditor and the permanent public safety task force. But to take that input and make sure that people are getting the police presence that they want, and perhaps explore bicycle patrols, foot patrols, things that will get officers really engaged with the community. The last couple are really just an encouragement that the department continue on the path that it's on, emphasizing guardian policing and de-escalation training, and to consider what a lot of departments currently already do, which is have some type of reward for excellent display of de-escalation skills and conflict resolution skills by police officers, and not just to award courage under fire and that sort of thing. And that will send a clear message about what the community values. Body worn camera policy is a big one. I'll try not to go too in depth. You can read the text. These are very detailed recommendations, but the gist of it is that we want to have wider buffers to make sure that police officers, even if they inadvertently are not pressing the record button when they should, that all parts of encounters, traffic stops, street stops and whatnot are captured, both the video and the audio that's relevant. We have a recommendation about releasing video footage after serious uses of force. This again mirrors policies that are in place elsewhere, like in the District of Columbia. Police release body camera footage after a police shooting within 5 days. We've made a recommendation that's similar here, but is a little bit broader and expands to just all serious uses of force. We advise against using the body cameras as a sort of testing ground for retinal scans and facial recognition and other biometric technologies. We make a recommendation about pre-report writing and review, which is another big topic in criminal justice reform. We've sort of steered a middle course here, and there are a lot of resources that we can point the council to, but the idea is that police officers can review their body camera footage to write a report in the ordinary case, but when they use force, because their perception that led them to use force is what's most important, they should memorialize that first, and then they can review the footage and supplement their report if necessary. And just because body cameras are such a quickly evolving, rapid and constantly evolving field, we want to make sure that this is something that is revisited regularly. If we can go on to the next slide. The other big recommendation here is about the public safety auditor. This is, the idea here is that there has been a big push nationwide for civilian oversight of policing, and there's been a big push by the Maryland State Legislature to do this with the creation of police accountability boards at the county level. The question is, what does Tacoma Park do when we have our own police department for a 17,000 person town, and most of the state reforms are really aimed at the county level. So the hope here is to complement what the state legislature has done at the county level and allow there to be some sort of auditor who can monitor the police and make policy recommendations at the local level. So this can either be an individual who is given a salary and does this as all or part of their job, or it could be a subset of the permanent public safety task force. But the job here would entail reviewing the internal investigations that are done by police officers, of police officers when there are complaints or other investigations of the misconduct, and also to serve as a place where police officers themselves can go and voice concerns if they feel like they can't do that within their chain of command. There would be someone who's not under the control of the police chief who could receive complaints from officers and concerns from them. The auditor would coordinate between different departments in the city, and also kind of draw in community input on police practices and policies, and make recommendations to the city council and to the police chief about any changes in policies and practices that they think would be advisable. And lastly, we hope that this auditor position will be able to review the more major incidents, including the David Dixon incident, which was something that a lot of community members have raised concerns about. And we know that there is an internal investigation underway looking into what may have been missed in the earlier 2020 incident. So we just want to make sure that the public safety auditor plays some role in that and is able to review all of the relevant materials, and that process is public and transparent, and that the public knows what the outcome of that review is. If we move on to 28 and 29. The thrust of this is really just to make stronger memoranda of understanding with our neighboring agencies. Since we have these new progressive ideas, we want to make sure that our law enforcement partners know what our policies are and encourage them to follow them. Next is 30. We have recommendations about new technologies generally and about license plate readers specifically. The idea here is to always make sure that we get community input before the police department rolls out some new technology. Probably the most infamous example would be the Baltimore City Police Department putting up a spy plane without notifying the public. We want to make sure that nothing like that happens, but we also hope that the city will revisit license plate readers. And this is one of the areas in which we have a majority-minority split. Majority of the task force would just eliminate the funding for license plate readers, given the privacy concerns that are introduced by their use. And the minority is not far behind. It really is just suggesting that the city council collect information from the police department about what the law enforcement benefits of the technology are, and then weigh those against the privacy concerns. Moving on to 33, a big topic with a little bit of text here, but the canine issue has been much discussed. A majority of the task force recommends that the canine unit just be defunded and abolished, but there is some agreement between majority and minority here, and that I think we all agree that it is time to move beyond using canines for apprehension, for chasing suspects to bite them. But there's a minority position that recommends that the canine unit continue to be funded so that it can be used for detection and tracking, which is a function that just allows the police to find valuable evidence. And there's an additional note about trying not using the canines for suspicionless drug sniffs. Our understanding is that from the police chief is that that's really not the department's practice. So the recommendation there is to really just continue on that course and to only use canines if there's cause to believe that there is a drug violation. So the last few recommendations, sorry, I know this is a long section, but the council had another split. Again, not too far apart between majority and minority, but there's $800,000 allocated for this new space in the community center for a new dispatch center and other sections of the department. Given that a significant portion of these responsibilities are going to move to new departments outside of the police department, the majority position is that this really should just be reevaluated top to bottom, and at a minimum, it should be a much smaller construction project. While the minority position, given just how difficult the confines are for the police department and how challenging that area is, that the project go ahead as planned, but that the city consider making some of that new office space available for some of these non-police functions. And lastly, the task force's recommendation here is that the city develop a proactive policy of just posting police complaints and the result of the investigations that are undertaken on its website. This is a reflection of a not much discussed piece of state legislation that passed unanimously called House Bill 183. I would encourage the council to take a look at that, but it contemplates that jurisdictions will take a proactive approach and not just wait for residents to file Public Information Act requests. The custodians of the records, in this case, the police department, can really just take the records once the investigation is complete and take that step themselves to put them out there so that everyone knows what their fellow residents are complaining about and what the resolution of those complaints and the related investigations are. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues.
You turn it over to Lauren. Thank you, Adam, for your thoughts, and thank you for your comments today. Lauren, you are up to talk about education and training.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adam, and thanks, everyone. This task force is full of such brilliant community members, so I'm happy to be among them. So I am going to report out on education and training, and there were really 6 goals that emerged from this task force. And the first one is to really kind of look at why crime is happening and to kind of understand that it's not happening because people want to be criminals. It's happening sometimes because there's other things that are happening in society and structural systemic racism that might be happening as well. That could be helped by expanding after school, job training, mentoring programs, et cetera, to kind of think of what's causing this crime. And so under that goal, there were 3 unanimous recommendations. And the first one was to kind of think about scholarships, weekend programs for children who are in Tacoma Park. The second one was to kind of think about job training programs for residents who may be unemployed or underemployed, or who may have been incarcerated and are coming back into the community. And the third one is to think about creating a mentorship program for high school students who would be able to kind of pair with residents and business owners who are already in Tacoma Park. And the fourth recommendation is a little bit back and forth, so it wasn't a unanimous recommendation, but we kind of thought about how we would fund these programs, and the majority thought that it would be funded through reallocation of the TPPD funding when some of the tasks that are currently in the police department are moved outside of the police department. And a minority of the task force thought that this should be kind of independent from any kind of reallocation. It should just come from its own fund. And so the second goal was around SROs, school resource officers. And so we currently don't have school resource officers in Tacoma Park schools, and we don't want to have them. And so because data really kind of shows that Black and Brown students are really disproportionately affected when SROs are brought into schools. And so we kind of want to use those funds in more beneficial ways, more holistic ways that can kind of benefit students. And so the main recommendation under that goal is to kind of pass a resolution. Even though we don't currently have SROs, we want to kind of make a stance that says we're not going to, and come out strong against that, and kind of send that to the county executive as well as the Montgomery County Council. And the third goal is really around education and educating students around what their rights are, establishing, funding for Know Your Rights and training for all students so they know what their rights are, how they can advocate for themselves. The fourth goal is around kind of breaking that school to prison pipeline by providing additional resources. And so we really want to kind of make sure that the administrators who are working in our schools and the teachers who are working in our schools, have training about kind of how they might be differently looking at and disciplining children of color, and also creating grants for Tacoma Park teachers to kind of get additional training that they might not be able to get at this time. The fifth goal is around kind of data collection and tracking the outcome of all of these recommendations that we kind of had already, and just to make sure that they're effective, and to kind of requesting information from MCPS to kind of see how disproportionately, tardies, suspensions, and all of those things are being given to our Black and Brown students, and to really see how we can kind of adjust that and address that. And the sixth goal is to promote and create cultural competency and anti-racism in Tacoma Park. And I think a lot of us, if you think about Tacoma Park, you think this might already be happening, but it's really important to make it a thing that we really focus on and ensure that it is happening. And we want to offer courses. We recommend offering courses that allow Tacoma Park residents and staff to kind of learn about all of the different identities, the racial identities, the sexual identities, and really enhance that cultural competency in Tacoma Park. And I think I got through that in record speed, and I am done.
Great job, Lauren. Thank you so much. And we are going to go back to Ajamel, who brought us into the conversation, is going to take us home.
Hey, everybody. I'll be relatively quick this time around. There were 2 other things that the committee felt strongly be included in the report. We were happy that these were programs that, at least with regards to the first one, we knew that the Tacoma Park Police Department didn't participate in, and we wanted to keep it that way. There was discussion both from task force members as well as the public with regards to the over-militarization of police. As we understood it, the Tacoma Park Police Department thankfully does not participate in the federal 1033 program. It's a program by which military equipment is filtered down from the federal government to local police agencies for policing at the civilian level. We recommended that the department continue to follow this prohibition of not participating in that program or other federal programs that transfer military equipment to civilian law enforcement agencies. And then the final one was we called for the council to review the Tacoma Park Police Department's participation in the use of civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is a process by which police seize property, oftentimes cash or cars or other valuables, under the belief, usually it's under the preponderance of the evidence standard, so much less than is required for a conviction, preponderance of evidence that the piece of property that's being seized was involved in criminal activity. Conviction is not required for civil asset forfeiture to occur, nor is actually the bringing of charges required for civil asset forfeiture. So a person cannot even be charged with a crime but have their property taken. So it's a highly controversial tactic that's used by some police agencies and prosecutors, and we call for the review of its use in Tacoma Park and, if appropriate, further steps to limit its use given its controversial nature. That's all I have, but I had just a couple, on a point of personal privilege, I'll just say a couple more comments, if you will. Many of you may or may not know that today is the sixth anniversary of Sandra Bland's death. I don't know how many of you are aware of that. And if you are aware of it, many of you may not know that all of the police agencies, both the individuals, the agencies that were responsible for arresting Sandra Bland, as well as where she was detained before she died, have since had their budget increased after her death. It's just, I say all this because, there's been lots of talk throughout the process with regards to some of the changes we're calling for will be difficult, and we understand that as a task force. But I think, we live in a different world than the world we lived in even just 1 year ago from now, much less 6 years ago from when Sandra Bland, one of the many people who's been unnecessarily killed as a result of involvement with the police. So, I said at the beginning of this process, when I was interviewed by Link, that, if I do things throughout the course of this task force, and here I'm really only speaking for myself, and everyone agrees with them and everyone gives me a pat on the back, then I think I've kind of failed, because these are hard issues that are going to require hard changes. And I would push the council and encourage the council to make those hard choices, even if ultimately, some people in the city government or some people in the police department don't agree with them. I think that's what the call for change actually means. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajamel. Thank you, task force members. I'm going to turn it back over to the mayor, Mayor Stewart. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jevin. Thank you to the task force. That was incredible. I want to remind folks that the meeting tonight is being recorded. So that was a lot of information, 50 recommendations. You can go back and watch it if that's the best way for you to retain information. The full report is also up on the council website, and so you can go through that, and the PowerPoint will be available as well. So depending on how you best absorb information, we have multiple ways for you to dig into all of this. So I don't want to take up too much time since I was able to look at these recommendations and join, as Councilwoman Searcy and Councilmember Siemens did, a number of the meetings of the task force. But I want to turn over to my colleagues on the council to see if folks have any questions, or if there are other members of the task force that want to speak. I know we just had some representatives of the subcommittees go over some of those highlights. So I see Jemana, you have your hand up. Did you want to say a few words before council asks questions?
I did, and I'm just sort of piggybacking on what Ajmal said, because he was clearly reading my mind. I was aware of the date, and it also occurs to me that in the conversations that we've had, and I've so appreciated the conversations that we've had with this task force. They've been long and intense and difficult, and sometimes exhausting. But in the context of it, I think oftentimes we were getting reactions, particularly sometimes from city staff, that were almost as if we were calling them out personally. And I think we need to be clear in this moment that we're not talking about individuals, right, on the Tacoma Park Police Department. We're talking about policing and what it should look like and how it can be done. And, in that context, and in the context of naming the people we're talking about, I know people talk about the David Dixon incident. David Dixon is charged with killing Dominique Williams and James Lionel Johnson, and their names should also be spoken. And I think that's what it comes down to for me in terms of why did I want to take this time. It's not because I had extra time. It's because in this moment, I really feel, I guess I think I forgot what two camps they broke it down in the beginning, that Tacoma Park can show itself as a leader in thinking about how it should look, what the imprint of policing should be, what kind of supports should a town, should a city, should a government be giving to its residents, in thinking about, rather than thinking about crime reduction as more patrols, more officers, more something, thinking about it as the kind of supports that were put in here, right? Not a ticket that says cut your lawn or we're going to fine you, but says, hey, we know your lawn isn't cut. Do you need assistance? Or, you seem to be having a breakdown. We have resources. And I think there's really an opportunity for this council to do something wildly different and show that it's successful. And because it is a small town, the opportunity, I feel, is greater because you're not dealing with multiple bureaucracies. We can move more nimbly. And I think we can show the way, and we can provide leadership to a lot of other places. So I guess what I would ask is, if you think about this very much term and thinking about the kind of society we want to live in, and not can we do this to this department or that department, because there are real people at the end of this. And I understand that the Tacoma Park Police did not kill Dominique Williams or James Johnson, right? I understand that. So I don't want anybody to try to tell me that I've tried to conflate these things, but that happened across the street from my neighborhood, right? We heard the shots at my neighborhood. And this is still very close to home. And I think that needs to be that the people whose lives are lost, the families who are grieving, the people who don't have the opportunities they need to be at the center of this conversation, more so than, does the police department seem to be doing this right? Do we like our particular chief? Do we like our particular police dog? But really the radical reimagining of what is the society we want to live in and how you all can achieve that.
Great. Thank you, Jemana. Before I turn it over to Councilmember Siemens, anyone else on the task force like to add anything? Well, just raise your hand if you do, and I will turn it over to Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. Wow, what a presentation tonight. I think you have done what we asked you to do, and done it with a lot of hard work, and really appreciate that. I have been on the council for many years, and this has been an issue that I have felt for a long time that we needed to talk about and look for alternative ways. And I think that you have laid in front of the council now a list of recommendations that I can promise you it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot more discussion and consideration. Some of these things probably can be done overnight or pretty quickly. And some of them may not get done, but I really, really appreciate the thoughtful approach that you've used, and I'm a little bit surprised to see that there's some things that are recommended based on really happenings outside of the city of Tacoma Park, but maybe that's good for us to think about and to make sure that as has been said, that we have the framework for public safety in Tacoma Park that is what we need for the future. And I just want to reassure our many talented, hardworking police officers here in the city that this is not a grade card. We're not scoring you and saying, well, you've done something wrong. This is to say that times are changing and we need to look and think about what are we doing, how are we doing it, and how can we do things better. It will be interesting to see how it evolves based off of these recommendations. But again, just thank you for the work that you have put into this.
Councilman Costick.
I, first of all, just want to really reiterate my enormous thanks to all of you. Just looking at that list of meetings that you all did and the amount of work, it's really staggering. And I think the product that we saw tonight and you see in the final report is very indicative of that. And I really appreciated all the recommendations that I saw there and feel like they're really grounded in some really thoughtful work and analysis. I see this as moving us along. As the mayor said at the beginning, this isn't the beginning of the process, but this is a really important first step for us kind of as a council to have the information in front of us to be able to now take the actions we need to take. And I really see this as, truly seeking to reimagine the way that we have been doing things. And I really appreciate some of the comments at the end that you all made with regard to, thinking outside the box, not taking this personally, and really thinking about the people most impacted by the policing structure that we have right now and the way that we're approaching public safety right now, and how we can take the actions we need to take to improve that. I have a lot of questions. I don't think we can delve into them all tonight. I guess probably one of my most kind of big picture questions builds on one of the comments you made in the kind of closing of the report, which was that one of the key questions now was to figure out which actions were the most urgent and which were the most immediately actionable. And I wondered in your discussions if you got into kind of discussing sort of the order that you recommend we approach this. And as others have said, I think there are things that probably could be acted on relatively quickly, but may not be as, top critical importance. And so I'm just wondering kind of which ones you see as kind of the direction we should take for next steps on this.
So task force members, please
jump in.
I'll just say, Casey, council member, from the report was not written in number 1 is number 1 and number 50 is number 50. So there's not a rank order to the recommendations or the topics. There are a lot of recommendations. Let's organize them in a way that's most helpful. So it was not written with a priority rank order, but task force members, if we can provide some guidance around where we think some of the prioritization might be as comfortable, that would probably be helpful.
Great. I see Jemana has her hand up. So
I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer in that, I think, first of all, there's two different questions, right? What is priority and what is most easily doable? Those are two different things. There may be some things that are very easily done that maybe aren't a high priority, that are very actionable that you can do, at your next council meeting. And I also think, and any of my task force members are free to jump in and say differently, but I think it depends on which one of us you ask in terms of what are the priorities. I don't think that we have, we didn't actually try to come to consensus on that. Like, I could give you my list. That doesn't mean that looks like Adam's list. It doesn't mean it looks like Sadie's list. It doesn't mean it looks like anybody else's list. And so I think that this is, at least for me, this is for you to look at and think about what you all think should be the priorities on this. Like, if I gave you my list, it would be my list, and you're welcome to it. I'm happy to do it. I can email you my list later, but I just think that this was, as much as you're sort of asking us, we did our part, right, in terms of coming up with this list. And I think it's now time for you guys to think about prioritizing. And, to the extent that there's any confusion on sort of what was behind it, there's not just sort of the goal laid out or whatever, but you can go back to some of the many discussions, and particularly these last few, and see what people were hashing out.
Great. Michael, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I agree with Jamon. I think the only thing I would say is that if I was going to prioritize one that's like a really easy one to do, it's basically keeping a task force in place. We asked for an extra month because this whole process felt very rushed. It was slow to get some of the information, and I'm sure that it was difficult to pull together by the police and others. So it took time. And I think there's just a lot of things that we didn't even really get to in any reasonable way. So I really feel like that would be one that would be very important to just keep the process going and keep this conversation going. Because just to give you one example, we never really got into any detailed conversation about the budget other than adding some programs, but we never, really talked about our our public safety budget overall and police in particular. And I just did some quick analysis. We have one of the most expensive police forces on a per resident basis in the area. And I compared with Greenbelt and Hyattsville and Rockville and Gaithersburg and Montgomery County and Howard County and Baltimore County. So we should be looking at that a little bit carefully and seeing, what we're getting for that, why that is. And that what I think also push us to push for some of these changes, because we really, if we're going to pay that premium, and I would estimate it's like $3 million a year premium that we're paying to have our own police department, we should be able to be a model for the communities around us, and we should be doing something different. We really better make sure that we're just a unique place and that we're providing for everyone's safety. And I think we can. So I would just encourage us to keep this conversation going and to keep digging in, because there's still a lot more that we never even got to, because this was a pretty compact schedule and process. The fact that we got as much done as we did is great, but I think there's much, much more to do.
Mm-hmm. Ajmal?
Speaking only, and thank you, Mayor Stewart, speaking only for myself and my experience on the task force, I think the priority from my perspective is evident in the concreteness of the recommendations as opposed to other ones that are less concrete. There are recommendations that call for certain practices to be taken. For example, the requirement of written informed consent before every search is performed of a car. I'm not saying that that's the number one priority, but the concreteness of it tells you that that's something that can be taken on sooner rather than later, and that the task force had specific ideas in mind related to it. Likewise, with regards to the details for several of the recommendations, when you have, under the task force, continuing recommendation that Sadie talked about, or under the community assistance office or the neighborhood safety team, there's a lot of detail in there that tells you the level of thought that went into those ones. I think my perspective, again, speaking only for myself, is that when you have concrete ones that call for concrete action, or there's a great deal of detail in a particular recommendation, it shows a particular clarity of thought and a prioritization around those, as opposed to ones that just say study an issue, for example, like civil asset forfeiture. It doesn't mean that it's less important. I think personally, civil asset forfeiture is incredibly important, but the vagueness of the recommendation gives you a sense of how much time and devotion the task force was able to give to a particular recommendation.
Christina, did you have your hand up?
I do. Thank you. I was going to say that I agree with everything that Chumana said, and also Michael, and what's being said around like the next level of analysis is really for you guys. But I will also say that in the listening sessions, and what came across each subcommittee in its own way was sort of the misalignment of social service needs and mental health support that exists throughout the community in lots of different ways, and how the police are involved in that. And that's been my personal experience from the building that I live in to like being a resident on a really busy street, to what people shared with us, to like what we heard also from members of the police department themselves. And so that also feels like something that has a lot of tentacles in a lot of places. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. And I'll just jump in on this topic and just thank the task force, because I do think the way you organize the recommendations, and some are more specific, some need more study. But given the space that we're in right now with the influx of ARPA funds, changes at the state level, changes at the county level, I think also provides an opportunity for the city council to take action in the short term, as well as take action as opportunities may come up. And so I really appreciate the breadth of recommendations that you did provide us, and how you did state like the overarching goals and then some very specific steps, because I think that provides us with the tools in which we can be looking at not just what we're doing here in the city, but what's going on at the county, at the state level, and tap into some of those as well. So I think there are some things I see in coming out of this that we can work on right away, and then other things I agree. I think there's more we need to unpack, but I just wanted to add that and say thank you for that. Councilman Costick, did you have another question?
I have just a couple of smaller, sort of more specific questions, and thank you all for those answers. I think that aligns well with kind of what I've heard from the community, as well, in particular with regard to the social services and mental health services that are provided and needed, and just the way that we approach this. And I have a number of questions here that I would love to delve in more deeply on. And I think the point that having some type of task force moving forward makes a lot of sense, because that would provide us with the mechanism to continue to have those discussions with a group of people who are really focused on this, like you all have been. So just sort of probably more specific and in the weeds questions I wanted to delve into, and I'll just mention two of them because I know my colleagues have questions and thoughts as well. One was with regard to the MOUs with DC and some other agencies. This is something that, particularly with DC, the lack of having an MOU, this has particularly impacted Ward 3 and the area along Eastern Avenue, where there have been some situations where it's been difficult to follow up after an incident happened. And the cross-jurisdictional sort of nature of things has been a big challenge. And I've been thinking through more. We were kind of trying to move forward with this a little bit. And then I sort of myself started to wonder a little bit about the potential of problems that could arise from having an MOU. And I wondered if you sort of got into any discussion about concerns with regard to how other agencies handle things, and sort of whether there was any concern about having an MOU that might allow for some cross-jurisdictional pursuit of someone by DC police potentially into Tacoma Park, or in other situations where there might be some interaction with another agency where we just don't really have that sort of oversight. Was that something that you thought about a little bit or have thoughts on?
Councilmember, I'll give you the information that we were presented from the police chief on this topic when it came up. He indicated to the group that he had sought an MOU with DC and was basically told DC doesn't do MOUs, where he had a much more constructive discussion with other jurisdictions. And so the discussion of the task force was around, would city council action on this kind of strengthen the position of allowing these discussions to happen? We didn't get in the level of detail that you're talking about. And my job is not to speak for the task force. They'll speak for themselves. But I think there would be a lot of openness to continued dialogue around that. The entire discussion on cross-jurisdictional was around, if we are and are going to model kind of best-in-class progressive policing, but then every other jurisdiction that overlaps here can come in and do their own thing, we're not doing anything to really protect our residents. So whether that's training, or it's formal MOUs, or it's leading by best practice in some sort of more formalized way, there was an attempt from the task force to say that's very important and we want to make sure it doesn't get lost. But task force members, please let me know if I mischaracterized any of that.
Great. That's helpful. And I think actually my second question somewhat relates to that, and your point of wanting to make sure that we have, as we continue to develop a system that prioritizes and more effectively manages public safety here, that we don't want others just coming in and doing things differently. My second question was related to the canine funding. And I noticed that your recommendation was to not fund the canine here in Tacoma Park. And one of the discussions that the council had as we were discussing this during the budget process was about not just the funding for the canine within Tacoma Park, but whether then a canine might be called in from outside to be used from another agency. And I'm wondering, in that case, it seems to me we might not want to just address the funding, but also sort of the policies surrounding how canines are used here and whether we would call in a canine from another agency. So I was just curious to hear a little more on your thoughts on that.
I saw that Ajmal and Jumana both put their hands up, if
Yeah.
that's helpful there.
Mhm. I think I saw Jumana's hand up. So Jumana, if you want to kick off on that.
Yeah, I don't know how different what I have to say would be than Ajmal, but I think in that context, if that is a route that the council is trying to go down, you should be extremely specific about the circumstance in which a dog will be called in. And the reason I say that is this. I mean, I think there was, different intents. And as you know, there was a minority who thought the current dog should stay. When I say think very specifically about what is the circumstance, I understand that some people said, well, fine, maybe not a random drug sniff because someone got pulled over, but maybe if we're talking about disrupting like major drug trafficking, the dog is not a bad idea. By the time you're at the level of major drug trafficking, I'm not sure that the dog is really what pushes you over the edge in terms of knowing that that's what you're dealing with versus a stop and a dog sniff. And so are you talking about a situation where there's like a bomb threat and you would like a bomb sniffing dog to come in? Are we talking about a situation where they're trying to apprehend somebody? Are you talking about a situation where, what is the situation? And think that through and be very specific. Because one of the things I know we talked to the chief about was, he says, well, because that was the option that was brought up, maybe we call in a dog from somewhere else. And here's the deal. If you call in a dog from somewhere else, they're going to come in with how they deal with their dogs. And if they deal with their dogs and their dog apprehends, that's probably what's going to happen. My personal perspective, and one of the reasons, we had a whole conversation about, are you willing to die on this hill? I was willing to die on this hill because I think that dogs should play no part in apprehension whatsoever, tracking down people. I think we have a history of, police dogs that is not in this country. I'm not saying in Tacoma Park, but there has been an instance in Tacoma Park that is not a positive one. So in saying that, I would say be very specific about what you want it for and be very clear about the parameters, and also be very clear about what you can control and what you can't. Because once you call a dog in from another jurisdiction, you don't get to necessarily put your rules on them, particularly if you don't have sort of agreements in place ahead of time.
I'll be very brief because I agree with almost everything. I agree with everything that Jumana said. So I think there's a piece that you can take from the minority recommendation and add it to the majority recommendation. I think the concern is that too often officers prolong stops unnecessarily to be able to get a canine there in time to engage in a sniff. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court over the last 25 to 30 years has drastically weakened the protections that exist under the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution. One of the pieces of the minority recommendation is to require reasonable cause of criminal activity or narcotics possession before a canine engages in a sniff. And so I think, Councilwoman Kostick, if what you could do is you could adopt the majority recommendation to cut funding for canines and then require that an officer establish reasonable cause before they call in a canine from another jurisdiction. You could further limit it, as Jumana said, by requiring that reasonable cause to be in a circumstance where there's not reasonable cause regarding narcotics possession, but reasonable cause of something more serious, such as explosives, such that a canine would only be called in if there was if it was a non-drug situation, a situation that was something much more serious than that. So I think those are both steps that you could take in addition to the majority recommendation, which would also limit the circumstances in which canines from other jurisdictions were brought in.
Jaman, I see your hand up again. Is that a new hand?
Yeah, well, Ajmal threw the Fourth Amendment in here, and that's what I do all day, every day. So I kind of had to throw this back in there. If you're talking about reasonable suspicion or probable cause, frankly, it's a very low bar. Like, we would like to pretend that that is a protection. It's not a huge protection. And so I just want you to be very clear on that. It sounds good. In reality, it's not at all hard to overcome. So if you're thinking of that as some kind of threshold protection, just be aware that it's not really.
Anything else, Councilman Kostick?
Thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing the discussions and delving in more on specifics myself, and I'm happy to chat with any of you on them specifically in the future as well. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do ahead of us as a council, and I just really want to reiterate my thanks to all of you and my commitment to continuing to move forward quickly on many of these recommendations. Thank you.
Great. Next, I'll turn to Councilman Dvala.
Thank you. I'll be brief. First of all, wow, this is very, very helpful. The way it's organized, the way it's presented, the amount of in-depth work you all have done is just awesome. It's going to take me at least a little while to absorb all of this and to address some of the issues that you pointed out, which are priority, which can be done quickly. One of the things that I had noticed and was going to comment on, but Michael Rubin beat me to it, is the question of budgeting and how this plays out in the short run and in the longer run, an area that's going to require some pretty major work. I have a lot of specific questions, but I'm going to hold them and just say again, thank you, and ask that the mayor or someone tell us how we can pursue asking specific questions in different areas rather than try to do it right now.
Great. Thank you. Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. And thanks to the task force. It really is a great report. And I don't know exactly what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting anything quite this expansive and detailed and thoughtful. So I really appreciate it. And I was taking notes when I was looking through it earlier today, and just in listening to the comments and the explanations. And like my colleagues, I'm not going to talk about every single point that I have questions or thoughts on right now, but the thing I wrote at the top of my list of a few things to say now was, let's keep the task force going. And some people may know that, I pushed for language in the original resolution to not have it stop right in June. And when I heard that it was going to stop right after the presentation here, even though we technically allowed it to go till October, I was not upset about it, but just wondering why we needed to stop it so quickly. So I definitely think if it's not this group of people, and it sounds like maybe for a lot of you, you've done your bit, and those are a lot of work, and you don't necessarily want to keep tying yourselves up week after week like this. But I think some way of continuing to have a version of this, I think, is really great, and we should definitely do it. And just a few other general issues that jumped out at me in hearing the explanation tonight and reading through it earlier today. The importance of focusing on the underlying issues. So yes, there's a lot of concern about what can we do to specifically address some aspects of actual law enforcement, but there's these other social or community issues, housing and the scholarship program and the mentorship program that were being talked about. And I really think it's crucial to do those as well, because there's uneven policing, but there are also problems that occur more in some areas than other areas that have deeper causes or a connection that go beyond just what happens with law enforcement. So I really think we need to do what we can on that. I think the whole approach toward how and when we can have non-armed personnel responding to situations, that's fundamental to this, not only here, but in so many other places around the country. And there's a lot in the recommendations about that. And I think that's something for all of us to think about. And I really do like also the focus on transparency. And when we hear about, or talk about, as we did earlier, what are some of the things that we could do more quickly, maybe transparency jumps out at us because a lot of the data is already there. And it's just a question of presenting it. I also think cutting back on law enforcement for minor matters, I'm not even going to say minor crimes, but minor matters that really don't need to be subjected to law enforcement. Those are all just bigger thematic things that I see emerging from the presentation. One of the things I wanted to ask, and maybe someone or several people on the task force could answer this, a big challenge we'll have is budget, as several people said, including Council Member Dybala, and also staffing, how many people are needed. And one of the things that's interesting is if you think about, well, let's have one or two social workers, just to take that, for example, who could respond. Well, if this is a 24/7 thing, you probably need more than that, right? And people go on vacations and people get called in the middle of the night. So it's really not just one or two staffers. And so one of the things I'm grappling with is, and the same thing came up in the context of our work on climate change, how many of these things should we do versus should we join in with the county in doing them and use some of their services, or should we pay contractors to provide the services? So if we accept the idea that we should have the type of social worker or mental health response capability for folks on the task force, have you thought through, and how important would you say it is, whether we have it be paid staff of the city, we piggyback onto a broader county program, we pay an outside group that can do it, et cetera. I would really like some guidance or commentary on that if it's something that people have thought about. And if they haven't, we can say that that's just something that we'll think about going forward. I think other questions that we'll have to grapple with, and I look forward to doing that, are, how much of ARPA can we use for some of these things? I think some yes and some no, probably. And then what are some areas where more research is needed? I personally don't feel like I know enough about how body cameras work or what the Fourth Amendment would and wouldn't allow in some of these automobile searches, for example. So I see those as being some areas where I personally would like to understand more before I'd be ready to say what I thought, although the level of detail was really great. Just a handful of other things I'll mention, and then I'll submit my other questions separately. I really like the idea of rent subsidies for police and other ways that we could help those who are interested in living within the city. I think that would be great. I like the idea of moving neighborhood services into a separate area from where it is now. I saw a lot of talk about training, and I think we clearly need to do more training. And since it's come up, I'll just weigh in on the dogs. I mean, I'd like us to eliminate it. I understand the concept or the concern if they come in from the outside, but we've had our own dogs that we supposedly had control over, and there were, negative, have been negative incidents with it. So I just think it's better to not have it. Maybe through an MOU, we could have some requirements in place that would govern how that goes. We can think about all that going forward. But again, I really appreciate the work. I think there's a lot to absorb. And I do hope that either this group or some other version of it continues forward, because we're going to need that on an ongoing basis to really be able to respond effectively to this. So thank you for all the work.
I don't know if any, Michael Rubin, if you wanted to respond.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I mean, Peter, what you mentioned about the mental health services and who should provide it, It's a really good question. I think the problem is no one in this area that we saw is doing it well yet. And we know Montgomery County added some new funding this year. So I think we need to look at what ultimately happens there. Do they do a reasonable job of it? Does it make sense to partner with them, or do we need to do it ourselves because we know that it's not being done well? So I think there's still a lot that needs to be looked at there. And I don't think we came to any kind of definitive because we didn't have a great example of how to do it in this locality. So.
Thank you.
Jemana?
Just a point on that. I want to say two things. One is we did have some great subject matter experts on and on this. And in particular, I think this conversation always comes back to mental health, but there's a lot of kind of disabilities that need to be accounted for, right? And so I just want to make sure that that is part of the conversation, that we don't just continue to revert back to mental health as if it is the only sort of issue. There's people who are neurodiverse, people who have, who are deaf, who are blind, who have other kinds of, issues that may change how their interactions with police can or can't work, or who may need other kind of services that is not just mental health. So, I think the council is always welcome to go back and talk to those subject matter experts and others, but just to keep a broader frame in mind when discussing this.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Councilmember Searcy.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you all again for the amazing amount of work that you all put into this, to the task force and the recommendations. As I started to kind of think about the path forward, right? One of the things that really came to mind for me was how much the recommendations that you all made overlap so much with the City Council's FY 2021 priorities, right? So I think that, for example, when you're talking about communications and changes that need to be made to the website and upgrades that are needed there, that is a council priority. We're talking about housing codes violations and how, housing is, trickling into conversations around public safety and what does that look like and what could we do? Well, we have a council priority around housing, and one of the big issues addressing quality in housing. We have a whole housing and economic strategic plan that includes some of those components. When we're talking about social service provision, we talked a lot about food insecurity in our community and how there may need to be coordination that happens. We have a livable community for all priority that includes making sure that we're able to connect services to vulnerable populations, including people who have low to moderate incomes or disabilities. So I do want to remind my colleagues that although on the surface, there may appear to be a bunch of recommendations that may cost money, and we have to figure out ARPA, but these recommendations align with recommendations and priorities that we've established as a council at the beginning of the year. And so I think the work will be in trying to organize the recommendations we've heard today around our priorities such that we're able to really think through from a council perspective, what are the priority initiatives that we want to move forward for implementation? So I think that's going to be the next critical step. And I agree with the point that was raised earlier. I would prioritize the city of Tacoma Park being coming up with a novel pilot to address mental health service needs in our community. I think that's something we can do. I think that's something we can think about. I think that's an area where we could definitely move faster than the county. And of the recommendations that are outlined, I think that's something that we should prioritize to start first. And I think we can use ARPA dollars to do it. And I will just be transparent in saying that. So I think that, again, I just want to, I think my comments are more for the council than for the task force. But I do just want to reiterate how much of an overlap what we're seeing and what we're hearing is with issues that we knew existed in our community prior to the task force getting started up. And I'm excited about the possibility for us to move forward. And we'll be working, of course, with the mayor to figure out, how we can start tackling these different areas and the recommendations, and working with staff to figure out how could we bring some of these more in-depth conversations that need to happen before council, so that we can kind of set that path forward. And again, council members Dabala and Kostick have been working with myself a lot on our committees. And, there may be an opportunity for us to, if I do my job, we push forward on maintaining the public safety task force, or figuring out what that iteration is and how we might be able to work something like that into how we're rolling out the next set of our standing committees. So if that's something that the council really wants to establish, let's go ahead and push that standing committee along with code changes that we're making in other regards. But let's try to push that forward so we can keep this task force going when we're doing recruitment for our other committees as well. So I do think it's going to be hard. It's going to be an uphill battle, but in terms of getting things done. But I do think that, if there ever was a time for the stars to have aligned around this issue, that time is now. And I appreciate the task force and Link and everyone working together to really try to help with setting that stage for how we could develop the strategy. So thank you all so much for all of your work.
Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
I'll be quick. First, I appreciate the time and effort that the task force put into this issue. My question is, did you guys look at the interaction with the police department and the youth in Tacoma Park? And specifically, how does a diversion program, how does it work in the city? I recently found out that kids have to actually admit to guilt before they can be admitted into a diversion program. Did you guys see anything like that? I think it's really critical that trying to make sure Black and brown kids don't actually become a part of prison pipeline should be a big priority for the city. And then also looking at how kids outside of Tacoma Park in Prince George's County, in DC, are there programs that are there that we could replicate in the city to make sure the kids are not caught up in jail or prison, something that would be a part of their life forever?
If there's a member of the task force that would like to speak to that. Ajamel, yeah, go ahead.
So thank you, Councilman Smith. Those are some really thoughtful comments, as always. So I think there are a number of things in there that sought to get at the school to prison pipeline. Number one, there was talk about SROs before, and my understanding is that although the Tacoma Park Police Department doesn't have SROs at Montgomery Blair High School, the Montgomery County Police Department does. Now, we don't have control over that, which is, somewhat frustrating to me as the parent of a child in Tacoma Park Public Schools who will eventually go to Montgomery Blair and is, somewhat, terrified is probably too strong a word, but deeply concerned about him interacting with SROs. And so, that's why we called for the resolution with regards to the elimination of SROs and the sharing of that with many Montgomery County officials who are Tacoma Park residents. I think it's frustrating to me that although I think that there is a strong contingent of Tacoma Park parents, of which I am one, who don't want SROs at Montgomery Blair, and despite the fact that there are many Tacoma Park residents who are at the top levels of the Montgomery County government, that continues to be the case. Number two, we called for the establishment of or the provision of additional funding for Know Your Rights trainings for students, such that even if they're not interacting with SROs personally on a day-to-day basis, they know their rights when they're interacting with police. I think that that's another serious concern we have, is that oftentimes young people don't know what their rights are when they're interacting with police. And then third, we also called for the establishment of new school discipline programs within schools that were not punitive, but looked to put into place alternative programs that would be more rehabilitative, or I mean, that's not really even the right word, because I think it's too strong with regards to the with regards to the disciplinary activity that was taken, but sought a more collaborative approach as opposed to a punitive one, and there are footnotes in the report about that. So I think those are some of the measures we sought to take to address the school to prison pipeline. But I agree, it's something that requires additional study. And I think fourth, I forgot this, but we also called for additional monies for after school programs and weekend program scholarships, which also sought to address the school to prison pipeline.
And I would just like to follow up on the Know Your Rights initiative that you guys are supporting. Is there any research data that says that if a Black and brown kid, that let's say they live in an apartment building, they're asked to show their ID, and they challenge a member of law enforcement on, constitutional rights or whatever, that they will get better treatment? I'm just, I just find it hard to believe that any law enforcement, whether it's specifically Tacoma Park or Silver Spring, DC, if your ID doesn't have a certain address, that a police officer might be concerned that, your parents are upper income, and there might be a challenge to any incident. I don't see how the police department is just going to say that someone waives the First Amendment, Second Amendment, whatever amendment in the Constitution, and police officers are going to back down.
Just to respond quickly to that, I think that that's why you have to see the recommendations in tandem. That's why at the same time that we're calling for Know Your Rights trainings, we're also calling for shifting of responsibilities in the creation of a neighborhood services department so that young people in apartment buildings aren't having as much interaction with police.
Jemana, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that point, it's not an evidence-based answer, but anytime I've given anyone any kind of Know Your Rights discussion, the first piece of that conversation is, do whatever you need to do to get yourself out of the interaction, right? And we all know that's a pressure-filled interaction. And that's why it also comes to things like consent searches being really problematic, because technically you have the right to say no, right? Technically you can say, am I being detained? And if they say no, you have the right to walk away. But the reality is most people don't feel empowered to do that, particularly young Black and brown folks, right? In the face of policing. And I think that's also part of why, even though the council doesn't have control over SROs, that having them on board, and vocally so, to take them out of schools. I know there's some discussion of just education, doing the anti-racist education, right? Not just the cultural competency that says, you might have Muslims in your class and maybe they're not eating sometimes of the year, or whatever it is that comes with that, but the actual anti-racism training that gets people to think deeply about the fact that the same behavior can be treated differently and many times unconsciously, right, by the same teacher, depending on what kid is doing it. So I think that's Know Your Rights is really just more of a mitigation strategy than one that is sort of healing the larger problem. And I think it's not just about the things in tandem, but thinking more holistically about the way the system operates, right? And so it is the education pieces, it is the training pieces, it is the pieces that makes the council vocal, even if they don't have ultimate control over the outcome. And, at the end of the day, it is modeling a society where we are more service-based than enforcement-based, right? And I think that is one of the ways that Tacoma Park can lead the charge.
Thank you.
Great. Adam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is not related to the last point. I just wanted to add a note here, at risk of souring some of the great relationships that I think I have made with my fellow task force members over the last few months. I just want to offer my personal words of caution that I'm just not sure how representative our recommendations are of the wider community. And I'm not encouraging the council to disregard them or set them aside, but you put out a call for volunteers who wanted to reimagine public safety. That attracts a certain segment of the Tacoma Park population that believes that reimagining is important and necessary and something that they want to devote months of their time to. Likewise, when there is a meeting of the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force and an opportunity for people to send in comments or to appear and voice their concerns, that too attracts a certain type of resident who is probably already disposed to think that certain changes are necessary. So I would just, I think that it's easy to look at people who are making recommendations that veer a little bit more toward the status quo and caricature them as timid or lacking vision or empathy. But I think that people can have very thoughtful policy recommendations that maybe are not as radical and transformative as others' recommendations are, but are very much geared toward public safety. If a K-9 is not available to track an armed robbery suspect and that armed robbery suspect victimizes someone else the next night, that victim's safety matters. And if a police officer does not make a traffic stop and remind someone or ticket them to encourage them to keep their kid in a seatbelt or a child safety seat, and there's a terrible accident that happens, that child safety matters too. So I don't want to get too revved up here. My point is just that there are 3 attendees right now. I'm looking at the list on the screen. I just don't know where the bulk of the 17,000+ residents of Tacoma Park come down on all this. So I would encourage the council to just be deliberate and very public about what it is you're proposing to do after you digest all this. That's not to say disregard it. I think these are really thoughtful recommendations. But when I step out of my house in my neighborhood, people don't say, "Hey, I saw you on the public safety task force meeting last night." Nobody knows I'm doing this, right? Because I don't think it's on people's radar. So if you're going to make a big change, just make sure that the people of Tacoma Park know about it and make sure that you give them an opportunity to speak to it.
Thank you, Adam. I see Jemana has her hand up and then Michael.
So, Adam and I have gone back and forth on this task force, and I think always in a congenial way. But what I will say about that is this. I think there's always an example that you can draw as to why certain things should be done or shouldn't be done. Talk about armed robberies. Honest to God, when I moved in 20 years ago, within the first year, there was a series of armed robberies. And the first one was a friend of mine walking literally from my house, the block and a half to the bus stop, right? And so, is it a question of, can we avoid all of those things? The answer to that is no. But you can go down other rabbit holes, right? And saying, well, what if that person actually had a job or, was paid a living wage and could afford an apartment and wasn't on the street sort of trying to take money out of people's pockets, right? It's like a whole nother rabbit hole you can go down. I guess my point is this. I think if you look historically, changes come not because all of hearts and minds were won over, right? And if you're a student of the civil rights movement, you'll know that Dr. King was vilified, that maybe 30% of the people were really supporting the reforms that were being called for, right? But what has been shown over time is not that you sort of everybody's convinced or even invested at the front end, but that policy is what leads change, right? You change the policy, you meet needs, and then people come to that place. I mean, you could look at Obamacare, right? It was like vilified. And that was the thing that the Republicans were going to destroy. But it turned out once people got healthcare, they really kind of liked it, right? And so I just, to sort of keep in mind that there is a discussion about, each individual case where a dog might be needed, or somebody didn't belt their child in, but there's a whole set of factors that comes into those scenarios, right? That maybe you were about to come home, but then you didn't. And so the armed robber's on the street, but you never made it there. Like, that is not really, from my perspective, the individual circumstance where something might happen is not the best way to legislate, right? And if you want, from my own personal history, what I watched post 9/11, and this is what I worked on, right, is every circumstance, every extreme possibility became something to legislate on. And we ended up with some real horrific abuses and a massive surveillance state, right? Because we were operating off of the idea that we cannot let anything happen ever. I mean, that was actually the idea of when we won the war of terror, was when no terrorist of global reach could ever sort of reach the United States ever again, rather than operating from the place where, realistically, it will happen again, right? Whether you now will call white terrorists in the United States as terrorists, or however you want to use that term, it's not my favorite term, but that kind of attack on a civilian population will happen. It's a question of, we're looking at what society are we trying to live in, and how are we trying to, move within our community, right? I mean, so I've worn many hats. And when I used to be, when I used to work with a sexual assault program, we used to do trainings, like we call them self-defense trainings. And we did teach some of the physical things, but the fundamental thing we taught people is the best defense against sexual assault is to know it can happen to you, right? Because if you try to engage everything around preventing something from happening that has so many factors, you're not thinking community good, but you're thinking like every possibility that we have to restrict. That's how we've gotten here. So my plea would be to really think about, to envision, what is the community that you want to live in? What is the community? What is it you want Tacoma Park to look like? What do you want the residents to feel in terms of, are their needs being met? Are they living in a place where they feel they have all of their security, right? Because food insecurity is insecurity. It's a public safety issue, right? All of those things. Their housing is secure. Their housing is safe. All of those things filter in. And if you just sort of take the lens of, well, what happens if you don't have a police dog in this one situation? You're missing a lot of what's happening that either creates a situation where somebody might be, committing an armed robbery, or, creates a lot more problems that maybe aren't treated by the criminal justice system, so they don't get linked up in the same way.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, thanks both Adam and Jamana. I mean, I think Adam makes one good point, and that's why I pushed repeatedly to find out how many people were touched in this process. And I know we didn't reach a huge percentage of Tacoma Park in this whole process in terms of people who showed up at the listening sessions or responding to the comment form on the website, or who were part of focus groups, or who we all spoke with, in whatever settings we could. So the one thing I would just encourage is that we were given a lot of really useful information, which is still not up on the task force website. So I would encourage the council to push to get the interactive presentations that we got on traffic data and arrests that was disaggregated by race, to get that stuff up there. I think it's really hard to judge our progress on racial equity, which we claim to be very committed to as a city. I think we need to give a lot more data, and we have to be a lot more transparent, as Councilmember Kovar noted, in order for the community to make some informed judgments and see where we're at. Because the one thing I will say is the people that we did hear from and spoke with were very thoughtful, really knew the issues, and had a lot of really good ideas. And I think that we're full of that in Tacoma Park. And I think we just need to trust our community to be able to get informed and give them the data so they can actually make their own judgments. I think that, that's what we used in order to get to where we were. But I think if we make it a regular part of our ongoing work, that, we'll find a lot more productive citizen participation in city council meetings and in other forums, and in hopefully future task force and the like. So that'll be my push for transparency and more information. But it was very helpful for me, and I think would be really helpful for a lot of my co-residents.
Great. Jide, are you on video?
Yep.
There.
So I was going to say that Adam's concern was actually one that I also had, and I think, like Michael said, I noticed that we had a 2018 focus group or what have you that from my perspective at least, was the most comprehensive information or insights that we garnered in terms of kind of what some of the Tacoma Park residents who may not have opportunities to attend these sessions were actually thinking. I noticed that their focus seemed to be on housing inequities in that area. and kind of the interactions between tenants and landlords. I think overall their views of policing, at least the way they espouse them, seem to be largely positive. But I certainly would recommend, and I think that there was a kind of a small note in some of the preamble or what have you of the document that Link created that talked about the need to actually do more focus groups. I think that going forward, it's kind of paramount. I am concerned that there wasn't enough adequate representation. And so I'd certainly like to make sure that our recommendations are more adequately kind of covering the larger Tacoma Park community. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Searcy.
Yeah, and I know we're over time, but what you all are highlighting is also things that we just had a community engagement work that was done around our rec center, where they focused on really trying to engage Black and Brown residents that live, focused on Ward 6 near the rec center. And one of the things that they highlighted time and time again is that, we have to take a different approach to engagement. And that's, something that, I think your process, as well as what we learned through that process, is highlighting. The sending an email out on a listserv, or asking people to participate via Zoom for something that doesn't quite resonate when we haven't quite built that personal relationship, particularly with, our immigrant community. That's something that we have to focus on, and that's something that we have to commit resources to, so that we can really bring all of those individuals to the table and they're willing to come willingly. Because I know that we often say, oh, well, we don't see a lot of people here. We don't see a lot of Black and Brown, the community that matters the most. But what we're learning as we're kind of engaging in these activities is, our current outreach approaches are not working. What we have to do is really commit to identifying new approaches to engaging residents of color in our community. And so it may not be via Zoom, but we need to be okay with that, and create those safe spaces and build those relationships ahead of time, so that we can bring them to the table. So I just want to put in a shameless plug, because I know that we were talking about race equity. We have some things in the budget that we've talked about community engagement. But this is just another example of how, changing our community engagement model is going to be important going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just said, Ajmal, before I go to you, I will say that the focus groups we did a few years ago, that was part of our resident survey that we do every couple of years. And that was actually the first time we had done those types of focus groups in conjunction with the resident survey. And I agree with you, like that was, having that be part of the resident survey was really important to be able to explore what issues we should even be asking in the survey. And I'm just going to put a plug, the fact that you got 2 researchers on your city council, that always helps. It's nice to have some lawyers and other folks. It's also nice to have people who do research on the city council. So I just wanted to agree. I think those focus groups we did a couple of years ago were really helpful. Ajmal, I think you had your hand up, and then Councilmember Kovar.
I'll be very short because I know I've talked enough tonight. I agree with everything that's been said about additional outreach. That's never a bad thing, but I don't want to sell short the task force and the makeup of the task force that we actually had. 14 of the 16 people on the task force were people of color. There were many people who either were sort of direct descendants of immigrants or were immigrants themselves. I'm first generation myself. So, I agree that we should do additional outreach, but let's not act like this is a task force that isn't made up of people of color and doesn't regularly interact with people of color, either in their personal or professional lives.
Thank you. Councilmember Kovar.
Yes, and I agree with what Ajmal just said. I think one of the reasons we picked this group was because we thought they could be trusted to be representative of many of the concerns. That doesn't mean, though, that as a council, we're going to decide these things based on, tonight's presentation, there's clearly a ton more engagement to be done. And I think the engagement isn't even so much about, hey, we're thinking about these 3 things. What do you all think? But it's about what are some of the other things we might have missed. And I do think it's worth noting, and Councilmember Searcy, I think, alluded to this. We have in the budget for the first time this year, and we haven't quite wrapped our heads around how we're going to do it yet. But I think the work connected to what the task force is recommending is probably a great one great starting point for this concept of what we've called variously navigators or ambassadors. And the concept is, you know, we're going to use some city resources to help identify and empower people who are leaders of various kinds within some of our neighborhoods and communities to help take on the role of ensuring that information flows in both ways to people who maybe haven't felt as welcome participating or haven't understood all the ways that they might be able to participate. And so I think I'd like us, one of my other things I wrote down, which I didn't mention because believe it or not, I'm trying to talk shorter, was how we're going to use that navigator ambassador concept specifically in the context of this task force work, because I think it really does have the potential to mesh well.
Great. Anything else? Looking at any task force member who's spoken or hasn't spoken, want to jump in? Any council member? All right, I think, Michael, you wanted to say a couple of words?
I'll just say thank you. As I mentioned, we get to lead really tough discussions around the country, and there's no tougher topic than this right now. We felt honored to be able to do the work in Tacoma Park. This was a remarkable task force of truly talented individuals supported by incredibly dedicated staff. There was nothing that we requested through this process that we weren't provided, and that's great. We had full access to the folks we needed throughout the process. I want to thank our facilitators, Jeff and Jamal Cordell, supported extremely ably by Molly and Carol and about 10 other note takers that were trying to capture every word. There's not one word in the recommendations that's ours. This was 15 people group editing a document until it got to a position that you have here. And that's incredibly rare and hard to do. And kudos to the task force for that. 2 things. Especially on this issue, it is really easy to have talking points and positions, but positions and talking points aren't recommendations or policy. What this group did was take positions and turn them into recommendations and policy. There's always more engagement to be done. There's always more meetings. There's always more process. None of that should take away from the absolutely incredible work that this task force did to take positions and turn them into 50 highly nuanced and incredibly detailed recommendations that's backed up by more research than you could want. And yes, it should all be public as quickly as possible going forward, but there is a lot here that should guide the council and future task forces in a way that is as important as the recommendations themselves. The last thing I'll say is, have no illusions that everyone has lots of free time to go back and read reports. But reading some of the focus group reports that were done this time, I think is worth some time for policymakers and some of the task force in the future. I was struck by the alignment. When we did a focus group of community ambassadors, and remember those were task force members that had applied to be on the task force but weren't selected, but still agreed to do a focus group with us. So when we had that focus group of community ambassadors, and then when we did the focus group of police officers, there were a couple points of absolute alignment. When we asked the community ambassadors, what should police not be responding to? Mental health concerns were at the top of the list. When you ask police, what should you not be responding to? Mental health concerns are at the top of their list. When you ask community ambassadors, what is one of the issues you see? It's that we're conditioned since we're little kids to dial 911 for everything. I have a 3-year-old. He knows to dial 911, right? When you ask the police, what's one of the issues? We're conditioned since we're kids to dial 911 for everything. There's chasms on a lot of these issues, and there's alignment on a lot of them. And I think that presents a really amazing opportunity for forward movement. And I would encourage us all to lean into that, because it's a pretty unique time with a council that seem poised to act. So thank you. We are no longer engaged. This process is done, but I do want you to know that we will ably and happily be a resource if folks have questions. And I will never seek to speak on behalf of the task force, but my guess is if council members had questions of the task force, force, they would all be available as well. We don't want this to be, here's the report, run with it. We want it to be, here's the report, ask questions, and let's do something with it. So thank you for the time.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everyone from Link who did work, I mean, literally, especially in the last couple of weeks, around the clock. I got emails, text messages, updates on where we were, when things can get posted to the website. It was really around the clock. I want to extend my thanks also to our Tacoma Park staff, particularly our acting city manager, Jessica Clark, and everyone who really just helped, move things along. I know we still have information to get up on the website. We will continue to do that. There was just a lot of work that went into this, and I want to thank everyone. This may, as Michael said, Link may be technically done with their contract, and we appreciate that they worked over their contract with us, and I'm sure they all want to get some sleep. But the work for us is really continuing. I know, again, I want to thank the task force members. You did more work than you had signed up for. You continued this process way into the summer, and we very much appreciate that. I will work with my colleagues. I know there are questions and follow-up to dig into this to figure out the best way to do that with all of you in the future. And to look at how we can implement some of these. Anyway, I think with that, it is almost 9 o'clock. I think this is your last Tuesday night meeting of the Reimagine Public Safety Task Force. Thank you. It won't be the last time you'll hear from us, I promise, but I hope you enjoy having your Tuesday evenings back again. So thank you all. We have our regular council meeting tomorrow night. If you want to hear about the Hillwood Manor project that Montgomery Housing Partnership is doing, tune in tomorrow before the council meeting at 6 p.m. and you can hear more about that. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you soon. We are adjourned.